folks out there in Progland. Supa Dave here, back in the saddle again, finally, after several months of hiatus. If you didn't see my previous video, you might want to check that out for the details. I won't bore you with them again here. Needless to say, life got busy, life had some changes. I am now a grandfather with a beautiful new baby granddaughter who came in towards the end of the year, so that's very exciting for me. And now that that hiatus is over, it's time for me to start bringing my end of the year lists, which got delayed a little bit because of impending granddaughter. She got in the way. I didn't get to do things exactly as I timed out to do them. So I'm catching them up now. Admittedly, a little late. I'm behind the curve compared to everybody else, but that's okay. That's where I've been most of the year. So meanwhile, this is my top 10 list of the albums of 2024 with my album of the year in Prog, which will technically be number 11. So you kind of get a bonus there. And I had a harder time this year coming up with 20 than I did last year, which is why I'm doing it that way. I will make note that I didn't get to listen to everything that I was hoping to this year, at least not to the degree I wanted to. I admit there are going to be some albums that I didn't give enough attention to really seriously consider for this list, which is probably one reason it's shorter. Number two, some of these things probably deserve to be on this list, and I missed them. There are things I look back over the year and I go, oh my gosh, I lost track of that. Or, oh my God, I overlooked that album entirely. How did I miss that? Don't know. Life is busy and it got ahead of me. So noting that as we move into 2025, the channel will be moving away from interviews. My new job does not give me the right combination of hours to be able to talk to folks in the other hemisphere, which if you're going to do a lot of prog-oriented interviews, you need to be able to cover both both hemispheres of the world. If you don't, you're going to miss out on more than half of them. So telling myself that maybe interviews will be sporadic, but I'm going to be shifting the channel towards album reviews. So for those albums I missed during this year, I'm going to try and do some make-good reviews later on this year. Maybe I'll front-load January with a bit of those to get caught up before we get into the meat of the year. We'll see how it goes. It's going to be playing a lot of it by ear. My understanding is there's a lot of great stuff coming out later. So keep an eye on this channel. I'll be bringing you album reviews, and I'll be tossing in some prog-oriented and prog-adjacent reaction videos, which seem to have been pretty popular, especially as I start digging into some of those bands that have a very dedicated fan base, like Cardiacs and Mr. Bungle and Meshuggah and all that. So I'm going to continue where I left off there. These things will be coming out weekly. I'll be a little bit more consistent since I won't be so dependent on getting interviews lined up. So that's what you had to look forward to in 2025, and I'll be getting onto that as quickly as I can after I get these end-of-the-year lists done. Meanwhile, again, we've got top 10 albums for me for 2024, Prog albums, that is, with the album of the year. And that's what's going to be happening now. And we're listing them alphabetically because I did not rank them. Too hard to rank them this year. I had a hard time doing that, and I didn't feel like it in the end because time crunch got to me. So I'm going to be listing them alphabetically by artist and keeping the album of the year for last, just to keep you in suspense. Some of you who are astute and know the world of prog and maybe know what I've been doing this year, you might guess what that album of the year is based on what's missing from the alphabet. But we'll see. There are a lot of options, I think. All right, so let's get this started. All right, launching off with the A's as one does with an alphabetical list. That would start us with Almo, Reconciliation. This is the solo debut of Benjamin Almo Thorcell, whose previous band ended in 2019, and he got busy working on this solo project. And this is an album that I admit, for some of you, it might be a little divisive. We'll see. It's up to you to decide what's divisive for you and what's not, but for me, it was an album I went back to pretty often and really enjoyed for its alternating between really crunchy, heavy stuff and distorted vocals and into more dreamy and at times orchestral passages with the clean vocals. He's really got a great ear for melody, and he really constructed some very nice songs here. And an album that was very confessional and personal and talking about one working through their life and their issues and learning to accept themselves for who they are. And I thought there was just something like really cool that resonated with me. Yeah, you know what? I'll admit, he does wear his influences on his sleeve very strongly, and it's pretty noticeable. And for some folks, that could be off-putting a little bit. For me, it didn't really create a problem. It was something that I enjoyed the work for what it is, and I recognize that, hey, from time to time, we are influenced by the people we admire to a degree that we aren't always aware of, and that can come out in the work we do when we don't even realize it. And if it does seem really similar, that can be okay. But I think he did a rather good job with making all of those influences his own, and at the same time making it very clear where his influences came from. It's not like he's the only artist to have ever done that. Even Dream Theater at some point in time has been responsible for doing that kind of thing. And I didn't mind them doing it, and I'm certainly not going to criticize him for doing it. So, Almo, Reconciliation. That was one of our albums. Moving on, of course, we go to the Bees. That would be a discovery for me of a band that's been around for a while, and yet I only discovered them by accident this year. That is Barock Project and their album Time Voyager. So that was an album where it was designed to take the listener through a time-traveling journey through musical genres and styles. And I really think they nailed that concept. A very cool album as it just shifted. And at the same time, it always kept that core that said, this is Barock Project. They didn't fully lose themselves. It doesn't come across like it's some sort of wacky mishmash of random songs thrown on an album. No, there is a through line in there during the album that is just this very kind of almost joyful and enthusiastic brand of prog that you can sense the influences that are there, but differently maybe per se from Almo, it's not as obvious exactly who they are being influenced by at any given point in the album as much as it is what time period in musical history is coming forth here. And you can really hear that strongly in some things like Lost Ship Tavern. I've forgotten the title all of a sudden, so I'm not even going to go back and correct myself. I don't feel like doing an edit. But that one, where it's got this kind of sea shanty, Renaissance-y feel to it, and yet it's still Baroque Project. Or Propaganda that pulls in this nice blend of almost Steely Dan-ish kind of, I almost hate to use the term yacht rock, but it was those songs in particular stood out. But just throughout the whole album, it's so engaging and so enjoyable. And boy, they can play the hell out of whatever's going on there. And yet it never feels like some of that overly complex and overly precious prog that some people get turned off by. It's all very accessible and very fresh. And really, these guys got a great melodic sense that I wish they got more acknowledgement here in the States. It's a shame that they don't, because they are a really fine band. Maybe someday they will. I hope that's the case, but very good. And one of my favorite discoveries of the year. All right, next, Caligula's Horse, Charcoal Grace. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. That album was anticipated to be a banger. Caligula's Horse has a great rep, and certainly they have a legacy to continue to uphold with their highly intricate and melodic and yet complex, expansive brand of prog metal. And let me tell you, if you've not seen them live, absolutely, that was one of my favorite concerts of the year. Absolutely was that energy and just that rock star vibe that was going on. They kicked ass in that in that concert. Absolutely well worth it. And they were one of those albums that, like, the year seemed very front-loaded with just great albums, one after the other coming out in the first couple of months of, maybe not the first month of 2024. But this was definitely one of those ones that was part of that glorious lead-off for the year. More aggression, proggy complexity, and yet at the same time I almost felt in some ways a little bit even more melodic than their last album. There was a darker edge to it, and I know this was influenced by COVID and the lockdowns and things like that, but I dug it. I really enjoyed that. For me, this ranks among their strongest albums, if maybe not even their best, but it's certainly up there. And again, the live show absolutely cemented their reputation for me. Well worth it. All right, coming up next, one of those later albums in the year that didn't get past me, and that would be Frost, Life in the Wires. This one I dug just from the fact that, one, they just pick up where they left off. These guys have released such a catalog of strong albums that are progressive and challenging, yet at the same time so accessible and melodic, almost pop level melodicism and a lot of this stuff. And it just, the musically they pull you in, but at the same time here we've got this double album concept story, as Jem Godfrey mentioned, that he wanted to do because he felt somewhere along the line a prog band should do that. And boy, did they do it. It's a really cool story and a narrative about a kid basically discovering somebody out there broadcasting like a pirate radio kind of thing, and looking for him and searching for him in a world that didn't really want to allow him to be able to make that connection and be able to experience that. And it was such a cool idea and a narrative. And it's interesting because I saw a movie at the same time around that album was coming out that almost helped me connect and conceptualize this on a more visual level too. So it was really very cool. And Frost just continues to impress. They really haven't, I think, had a letdown album. So big concepts, big hooks. The length of the album at no point in time to me feels stretched. As a matter of fact, it goes by almost a little too quickly for an album as long as it is, and not in a bad way. I dig it. That's one of the ones that immediately grabbed me with the songs, and certainly you can expect this album to be placing a song on my Song of the Year list. All right, moving forward. Next, we have another one of those front-loaded albums, Steve Hackett, The Circus and the Night Whale. Hardly anybody on this planet is more prolific than Steve Hackett has been. And he's got so many really fine albums, and yet this one jumps up there and ranks among his finest, going almost all the way back to the beginning for him. The Acolyte being one of his most revered albums. I think I got the title right there. I didn't write it down. I'm walking off the top of my head, and once in a while I trip up. But the autobiographical aspect of this album really, I think, lent itself to you, the listener, getting to experience all the aspects of Steve Hackett in one album, with a connection that is probably more personal in some ways, as he's digging into his life story a bit, more so than other albums. So there's sometimes prog can be, and any album really, but prog especially, can be a bit detached in its intellectualism, and it gets fantastical. It's telling stories, and they may or may not have a personal connection for the artist. In this case, absolutely. And you get like almost a Steve Hackett greatest hits, but such in a way that doesn't feel like he's just regurgitating. It's fresh. It's got some really great songs in it. Matter of fact, one of my favorite songs of the year is on this album. And Steve's voice has aged so gracefully that, after all this time, he can still put out such fine music and such fine singing. His playing is top notch as it is ever. He was one of the ones I was lucky enough to see live this year as well, with his touring band. And Steve's still a rock god among the progressive world. Really, outside progressive world, wherever. He is a guitar god. He has not lost even a bit of his edge. And this album absolutely confirms that. So absolutely not just a great album for the year, but a great album for Steve Hackett's career. And so cool to see somebody this far into their career still churning out such vital music. All right, coming up next, an album that was absolutely a bolt out of the blue for me this year, Kyros, Mannequin. This one, from the moment I heard Esoterica, I was enthralled. It was something that I had never quite heard before. It connected with me on an emotional level. But as soon as I heard the song, I did a reaction to it, so you can actually see my live reaction to what this was. I had no idea what I was walking into, and it just blew me away. And this is one of those ones that made it so tough for me to pick an album of the year, because you know these albums we're talking about are so cool. But these guys, such a unique blend, a seamless blending of early 80s new romantic and synth pop and new wave and new jack funkiness. It's a lot of new in there, isn't it? For stuff that's 40 years old, 30, 40 years old. But new jack funkiness and all that with prog rock composition and songwriting sensibilities. It's such a cool blend. It's literally as if at some point in time Duran Duran or somebody said, hey, let's decide to be Yes on this album. And it was Yes through the filter of Duran Duran or New Order or something. It's such a cool and engaging and fun album. And that's the thing, is oftentimes it's easy to lose track of the fun in a lot of prog because it gets so intellectualized. And I think a lot of these bands have been able to move through that. But this one, absolutely. And at the same time, the amazing thing is with these bouncy, bright melodies and these 80s keyboards and this kind of bouncy, poppy music, there's this dark undercurrent of lyrical themes. And I dig that. I always like that contradiction of bright music with dark themes and dark lyrics. So that was just absolutely one of the albums I easily have listened to most this year. Nothing like it. And if you know me, if you've been around, you know I love uniqueness. And this is where Kyros absolutely, positively came out of a cocoon, and they're a big goddamn frickin' painted butterfly. Beautiful stuff. Absolutely beautiful stuff. Now, next one, we're going to basically flip stylistically about 180. And for me, there were a few things more exciting this year than the final return of Opeth after a 5-year hiatus with The Last Will and Testament. And it also was, in a certain sense, like a bolt out of the blue, because there was no reason at this point in time, I think, in advance warning, that anybody would have expected Opeth to dip back into their death metal roots. And suddenly the growls are back. And at the same time, they didn't abandon the heavy 70s influenced prog that they've been doing for the last, 10, 15 years, I guess it is at this point, maybe longer, since Watershed. That I know turned some fans off when they left the death metal realm. Didn't turn me off. I always dug it. I was never a big fan of growls, but if there's anybody that can make me a fan, it's Michael Ackerfeld, pardon me. He's one of the finest, and the compositional audacity, I guess I would say, of Opeth is what really makes it. And the fact that they balance the growls with the clean vocals. And my God, the guy's such a fine, clean vocalist. It's amazing to hear his range. But this album, to come back and basically fuse those two main periods of Opeth, the original death metal with the growls and all that stuff, along with their recent proggier stuff, and more, I don't know what to say, more grounded, more traditional proggy stuff with a heavy influence of jazz fusion. And for me, every time I hear that stuff, I'm thinking back to like early Rainbow. And just, this was such a cool thing. And to think that it's been that long since the growls were present. It is the first time in 25 years they are doing a story-oriented concept album, Still Life being the last one. The first time they've included strings in their music, and the results are really, really impressive, especially as a listen as a whole album. It's that story and the progression. There are elements they blend in there that they have not really, I think, done before. Vocal flourishes, and we mentioned the strings and some keyboard styles and sounds. Chef's kiss, really. And the fact that you not only did that, you had space to throw in Ian Anderson with some flute. You had space to throw in Joey Tempest from Europe on backing vocals. Like, just so cool. And I know that Ackerfeld has said it was inspired largely by the TV series succession for me, listening to it, and I think probably especially in the vein of the music that Opeth puts out, which is very dark, fall or winter, almost Halloween, because of their tendency towards themes of death and ghosts of perdition and hauntings and things like that. To me, I've had in mind the Fall of the House of Usher, the TV series. I almost feel like this is like the musical representation of that. If you haven't seen that series, go watch it. It's fucking awesome. So for me, it's my favorite album of Opeth's since Ghost of Perdition. I can't say enough. I really have enjoyed it, and I think it's the one that I have felt most enthusiastic about going back that far. There's maybe not a kick-ass song that quite sticks in the head as quickly as Sorceress did, but there's a lot of great songs in this. So, Opeth, The Last Will and Testament. Hopefully not the last. Meanwhile, moving on, Pure Reason Revolution is next, coming up to consciousness. This is a band that I always worry doesn't quite get the attention they deserve, and that they are a bit of a dark horse on this list. But since they returned from their hiatus in these last 3 albums, I just have absolutely loved them. They are a groove and a mood that I just totally dig, and they're flowing between dreamy, moody, mellow music, and then suddenly this kind of prog metal punchiness and chugginess that goes on. And there's maybe a little less of the prog metal influences this time around, but there's still that overall mood that just hits right there for me. And this album, with its explorations of grief and loss and fear, and just covering some of the darker emotions, the music reflects it in some ways, but it's not ever oppressive in my mind. It's not something that weighs the album down or leaves the listener feeling depressed afterwards. As a matter of fact, I feel like there's an undercurrent of hope that goes through it. And that's not an easy thing to do when you talk about that subject matter. So pretty much going in, as soon as I knew they were coming out with an album this year, I had a feeling it was going to rank very highly for me because I've enjoyed their last 2 albums so much. If you like those last 2 albums, if you like their overall body of work, you're going to like this too. If you haven't listened to it yet, go find it. All right, coming up next, and we're getting close to the end of the top 10, we got Turbulence, Binary Dream. This is an album that I worry a little bit could get overlooked. But they hit the same spot for me this year that No Spoon hit last year. It's this dense concept album talking about the shift from a artificial intelligence to a sentient being. So high concept, high sci-fi type stuff with this intricate and complex shifting moods of music. Again, it hits a similar vein to a lot of things like Almo I mentioned earlier, or Hackett or Dream Theater, with its shifts in texture and tone and tempo and mood. They have the daring thing of 2 instrumentals back to back early on in the album, which for me didn't really disrupt the flow of the album, but they just, it's hard to put into words. I mean, it's top-notch playing throughout, excellent vocal performances, and engaging and enjoyable melodies is really what it comes down to. So these guys have the chops. They are so good, and I recognize it's a shame, that coming from Lebanon, it probably gets in the way of them finding a wider audience. So in that sense, I'm kind of glad to put them on here, and it's one of those fun things when you discover that there's so much out there outside of the traditional US, Canada, Europe bubble that most prog exists in, and these guys were a really cool discovery for me. This is an album I went back to a number of times and really enjoyed. All right, and finally, rounding out my top 10 albums for the year in prog, that would be Triton Project, Messenger's Quest. This is an album that really, absolutely, positively hit some right chords for me. Now, let's note, it's the 4th album this year on my list that has a narrative format concept. There's a lot of conceptual albums there that are thematically a concept, but I feel like, I don't know if it's me, but these storytelling albums seem to be on the rise all of a sudden. But obviously that appeals to me, clearly. So, fourth album on the list that was the fourth album on the list from an artist that I was not previously familiar with, that I discovered this year. Now, of course, Triton Project is a debut album, and a very impressive debut album. It's essentially a solo artist because we've got a mastermind behind it, but of course there was a lot of help and assistance there. So I don't want to minimize the idea that this was a multi-person project, but the core of it really is a solo project, and that's what makes it even more impressive. Is just the density of it and the level of ideas that are involved. And the production and the playing, top-notch, but in many ways reminded me of early Dream Theater, probably most specifically A Change of Seasons, in that the production didn't sand off all the rough edges. It didn't feel like overly processed, or it didn't feel like it was too clean and too precious. It had a grittiness that I was hearing that I really liked, and the complexity of it and the way it is composed and the singing, really you could hear that Dream Theater influence. And such a cool album with this fantasy oriented story going on about, of course, the messenger and his quest. The clear influences being there, never felt like at any point in time they were just copying Dream Theater or anybody in particular. They had their own thing, and the style reflected their influences a good bit. But it's such a cool album, and it's impressive on a debut and a bit audacious, I got to say, to include 2 songs that are 23, 24 plus minutes. You don't see that happening, and I think it takes a bit of boldness and I'd like to think a bit of confidence to be able to do that. And it's just, I almost worry that, man, you come out with something that's essentially a magnum opus of this quality on your first album. How hard is it going to be to come up with a follow-up? So those are the albums that I went back to the most this year. Again, you'll notice my tendency is to lean towards the prog metal end of things. That's just always been where my sensibilities lie. I like the hard edge stuff. Honorable mentions I can throw out there, obviously, and one that I'm almost certain is going to be controversial for being left off the list. John Anderson and the Band Geeks, True. It's a really, really good album. It's a great album in many ways. Probably, I think arguably the best Yes album in 25, 30 years. Some people might say the best one since Talk. I wasn't as enamored of Talk as other people might be, but in that sense, it was John Anderson doing Yes music to about the highest degree that one can do Yes music. Also means he didn't really step out of that mold very far. The boundaries were there, and he colored within the lines, and he did a damn good job of it. And certainly the Band Geeks did a remarkable job of being a modern day Yes, sounding in many ways, in some places, like Yes reborn from years past in the 70s. Really damn good. Didn't quite stretch the boundaries, I think, enough for it to make my top 10, but probably would make my top 20. Also, David Gilmour. If you saw my reaction to it, I'll admit, I had kind of not paid a lot of attention to his solo work since About Face. So we're talking 40 years since I last really paid attention to him. And I liked About Face a lot, but I didn't love it. I never did love it. And I didn't really think I expected to hear a lot that I loved from him, which is probably why I ignored it. But this is a really fine album. It's quite a good album. It's quite enjoyable. I wish there was more on it that hit the heights of The Piper's Call, though, because that song I love. That song took me by surprise a little bit because it was outside of what I was expecting from him. But the rest of the album is well worth the time. Lowen is another band I didn't end up putting on this list, although they really struck me as impressive with this album. I'm probably going to mispronounce, but Do Not Go to War with the Demons of Mazandaran. That is the album title. It is another kind of story concept album digging into Middle East mythology and things like that. A very cool concept and a very cool approach. A band that's got their own unique sound and you know, a blend of prog and doom metal and a little bit of symphonic sprinkled in there. Maybe a little bit of death metal sprinkled in there, although clean vocals, but the vocals themselves are unique. It's not the kind of thing you normally hear. And typically a band like this is not frequently fronted by a female singer. But she pulled out some really, really awesome work on this. Them as a band, there was maybe, for me, a little sameness from song to song. That's maybe what kept this out of my top 10. But it's also an album that maybe I need to listen to a little bit more because I didn't quite get to do it as much as I wanted. And meanwhile, Jordan Rudess gets a little bit of a shout out from me. Permission to Fly was the album. Jordan's solo efforts have had a tendency towards a bit of excess in terms of, I guess we'll call it self-indulgence, if I can use Rush's term. This one, I think, shifted gears, a little like Rush did at one point in time, into more concise, more self-contained songs, and he really, it was probably his best solo album. Honestly, if I may say so, I do believe I would call it that. At least in terms of a rock format. I won't say I've listened to all of his stuff that may have been outside of that, but yeah, very cool. And again, with the idea that some of his previous albums got a little overwrought, I guess we'll call it. This one was a nice shift, and his bringing in of that Joe Payne for vocals, amazing addition. That Joe Payne is someone I want to hear a lot more work from in the future because his vocals are just amazing on this album. And I think that's also probably a theme running throughout so much of what I'm talking about here is like the vocal performances this year was so cool. Between, you know, Almo, Barock Project, Caligula's Horse, always great vocals. Frost, great vocals. Jem Godfrey coming back to the primary vocalist role that he hadn't done for a while. Steve Hackett in just great form. Kyros, yeah, really, it's just so many great vocals, and that's where Jordan really nailed it with bringing in that Joe Payne. So, if you haven't guessed so far, my album of the year may or may not come as a surprise, but where I landed, and again, I was back and forth between 3 or 4 albums trying to figure out which one of them I really wanted to land on because I could make arguments for all of them. I landed on this one for emotional reasons, and that would be Big Big Train, The Likes of Us. For me, given the circumstances of what was happening with this band at that moment, coming back from the loss of David Longdon, clearly a beloved member of the band, their frontman, their primary songwriter in most ways. And it's reasonable for us to have come into the album expecting that some way they're going to be processing their grief related to that loss. Things were uncertain. Nobody knew what they could necessarily expect with the addition of a new frontman, but Alberto Bravin stepped in and knocked it out of the park. The band as a whole, for me, even in their loss, there was a sense of clear rejuvenation that they were able to, I think, get into and deal with the grief and the loss of Longdon in a very uplifting manner. You know, everybody does their grief differently, but there was something spiritual, I think, in many ways in the way they processed this. They didn't get into maudlin nostalgia. There was never a sense of just sadness. There was a sense of, yes, there was a loss and probably some sadness, but there was the joy of knowing David and having had them in their lives, I think, that came across mostly to me. And Alberto coming in, and he didn't, it wasn't a switch from, like, say, David Lee Roth to Sammy Hagar, where there was a clear massive stylistic change and somebody new walked in and had to put their own stamp in it. That wasn't the feeling. It felt like he just walked in and they showed another aspect of the band's personality, and almost as if he had always been there. And I understand that they were so welcoming of him. It just fit. And his vocals were so fantastic. And the writing he brings in, it just between those things, the communication of the deep emotion, his impeccable phrasing and his impressive range, man, I think with all that, I think that sense of triumph that came along with this album, him coming in and adding that multi-instrumentalist dimension and the way that they blended the band backing vocals in with his, that really gave one a sense of unity within them. So for me, just such a fine album, and so re-listenable, and feel a little bit more connected to them every time I hear it. So to me, it really just came down to very much the feel-good story of the year, with everything they had to deal with and how well they dealt with it. It's just so hard to expect a band to come back with something so strong after all of that. So that emotional connection is what really did it for me, for them, where I finally made that decision to pick one. Big Train, The Likes of Us, album of the year on Bleeding Edge. We'll see what happens next year with my upcoming shift to album reviews. I plan to do those weekly. I plan to have a pretty systematic approach to it. I'm going to hope at the end of the year that's going to make my job easier putting together a list. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. If you stick around, I hope you do. If you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you do. And let me know your comments. Let me know your thoughts on what this list turned out to be. Be nice. I'm happy to discuss, because I know there are certainly albums I overlooked. There are artists that I ended up overlooking. Probably not deservedly so, but it's just a factor of how my life went. And I think when anybody does one of these lists, that's the thing you got to consider. The framework of a person's life is going to affect how they feel about all this stuff and what they see and how they understand it. So that's all I have for you now. So I'm going to get out of the way. Don't forget, never be afraid to deviate from the norm. I will see you next time.